My name's Elijah Brody. 62 years old, retired U.S. Forest Service officer, and still waking up every morning at 5 a.m., whether I want to or not. For the last 18 years, I've lived alone on a sloped acre of land that backs right up to the dense state forest near Pine Hollow Ridge. My home sits on the edge of wilderness and suburbia, a 2-story log frame cabin my wife Sarah and I built before cancer took her in '07. The place means more to me than I can explain without sounding like a sentimental fool. But if you've ever lost someone and still feel them in the wind that moves through the pines, or see their shadow in the morning light flickering across the porch, then maybe you understand. What some folks call just a fence to me was a line drawn between civilization and something far older, wilder, and less predictable. I built the barrier with rough-hewn cedar posts, 4 strands of tensioned wire, and steel pipe reinforcements buried deep to stand against the root systems and erosion that came with each season's flood. It wrapped around the eastern edge of my property, marking where my land met the game trail. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't some quaint country addition. It was a necessity. We had boars up here, feral hogs, not the cute cartoon pigs you see in kids' books. These were mean, invasive monsters, some with tusks longer than a man's forearm. And they traveled in sounders groups of 10, sometimes 30. They tore through the forest like wrecking balls with hooves. I've seen what they did to undergrowth, how they hollowed out entire patches of hillside like rot in an apple. When Sarah was still with me years before her passing in '07, one came up to the back deck one night while we were watching television. We heard a snorting crash, looked outside, and saw the railing splintered and blood smeared down the banister. Turned out it had tried to go after a fawn hiding under the porch. That's when I reinforced the entire perimeter. And for 16 years, that barrier held. Kept my land safe. Kept the animals on their side and us on ours. Neighbors used to thank me, especially the ones downhill, since a boar charge on a slope gathers speed like a bowling ball made of muscle and bone. But then came the HOA. I should have known from the second they started showing up in pressed polos and clipboards that the real predators weren't in the woods. The Homeowners Association called themselves Pine Hollow Beautification Board, as if adding some petunias and banning flagpoles could disguise their hunger for control. I wasn't even in the HOA when I bought this land. The subdivision came later when a developer bought the land next door and squeezed in 16 homes between 2013 and 2018. They expanded the HOA's jurisdiction, and suddenly, my grandfathered property was non-compliant. First, it was small things. A letter about my mailbox not matching the aesthetic. Then one about my agricultural structure, which they meant to be my tool shed. Then finally the barrier. The first letter arrived in spring. White paper gold letterhead, the kind of bureaucratic arrogance you could smell through the envelope. Dear Mr. Brody, it began. The barrier structure on the east edge of your property line has been determined to be in violation of Section 12C of the Pine Hollow Design Standards, specifically in relation to unapproved perimeter fencing. It went on like that for 2 pages. No mention of wildlife. No acknowledgement of safety. Just aesthetic consistency and unauthorized construction. They wanted it removed. I called the number on the letter, got a voicemail, left a message explaining who I was, what I'd done for a living, and why that barrier mattered. Never heard back. A week later, I got a final warning notice with a $500 administrative fine attached if the barrier wasn't taken down within 30 days. Let me tell you something about retired forest officers. We don't bluff, and we don't forget. I sent back my own letter, certified mail, 3 pages, single-spaced citing state, and county wildlife management codes referencing boar migration patterns documented over 2 decades, and even included photos of previous hog damages along the eastern slope. I thought that would settle it. Thought they'd see reason. But they didn't want a conversation. They wanted submission. By midsummer, I noticed cars driving by more often. Men and women in khakis with cameras jotting things down in little notebooks. One of them had the nerve to take a photo of me while I was working in my garden. I waved. He didn't wave back. 2 days later, another letter. HOA hearing scheduled. My presence was requested. I declined, not out of pride but principle. I'd already explained everything that needed explaining. This was my land. That was my barrier. The next morning, I jolted awake to the harsh clang of metal on metal. A backhoe's roar tearing through the dawn, its engine snarling like a beast unleashed. Tires grinding gravel. And 3 orange-vested contractors pulling at the corner post of my forest barrier like it was a weed in their way. I was still in my flannel pajama pants and boots when I stormed down the hill, shouting. "You're trespassing," I bellowed. They didn't care. "We were told to proceed," one shouted back over the engine. Told by who, I demanded. He nodded at the clipboard. HOA president. We got the work order. There wasn't a sheriff's notice. No legal order. Just an HOA work order printed off a laser printer with a typed signature at the bottom and an air of entitlement as thick as the forest behind me. I told them to stop. They didn't. By noon, the entire eastern barrier line gone. The Boars had been watching, I swear to you, from the tree line, like they knew what was coming next, and so did I. The fence was gone, and by Wednesday, the first complaints began trickling in, as if the forest had been waiting to reclaim what it had lost. It started with a woman on Pine Hollow Drive posting in the neighborhood Facebook group. Something rooted up my petunias and overturned the trash bin last night. Claw marks on the porch. I'm terrified. Then another, this time with a picture. Is this a wild pig? It was in my backyard this morning when I let the dog out. The photo was grainy but unmistakable young boar, maybe 100 pounds, tusks, just forming bristled hair raised in warning. And that was just the beginning. By the weekend, 5 properties reported sightings. 2 cars had been damaged, fender dents, and tire punctures from panic braking during night crossings. 1 dog injured. And yet, instead of connecting the dots to their own actions, the HOA doubled down. Monday morning, a formal HOA notice was hand-delivered to my mailbox. This one wasn't printed on pristine letterhead. It was hastily formatted, probably typed at midnight by someone trying to cover their tail. Dear Mr. Brody, it read, we are gravely concerned about the recent wildlife incursions occurring in proximity to your property. As a longtime resident, you have a responsibility to ensure that your land does not pose a hazard to the broader community. Responsibility. They demolished the one structure preventing this. Now they were implying I was negligent. The letter continued. We ask that you take immediate corrective action to mitigate further wildlife trespass. Please submit a plan of action within 72 hours or face escalating fines and further legal action. That's when I knew they were not only ignorant, they were dangerous. I drafted my response that same night. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. I attached high-resolution photos of the demolished barrier timestamps from my security camera and my formal statement to Wildlife Services. I included a copy of my property deed. I cited California Civil Code SOR 34825, noting that landowners have no duty to modify natural land to prevent its natural condition from causing harm to others. And I CC'd the email to the local news station's environmental desk, the mayor's office, and a legal contact I had from my years testifying in wildlife conservation hearings. By morning, my inbox was already lighting up. A reply from Karen. They're poking the wrong bear, Eli. Let me know how we can help. But the HOA wasn't backing down. Instead, they called an emergency community meeting. They plastered the neighborhood mailboxes with red notices. Mandatory attendance. Community safety concerns. They made it sound like I was some kind of forest-dwelling menace. I hadn't spoken at an HOA meeting in all the years I'd lived there. But that night, I put on my cleanest shirt, pulled out my old forestry badge, and walked down to the community clubhouse. The place was packed, standing room only. Couples with children on their hips. Retirees clutching note cards. A few police officers on standby at the entrance. At the front stood Janice Mallory, the HOA president. A woman with the poise of a televangelist and the charm of a trapdoor spider. She opened with a slide presentation. Photos of damaged yards. A kid's bike turned over. Scratches on siding. This is a crisis, she said, clicking to the next slide. And it started with one man's refusal to follow basic community guidelines. All eyes turned to me. I let them. Janice waved a thick packet in the air. This was the fencing we removed. Unauthorized. Obstructive. Non-compliant with Pine Hollow aesthetics. She didn't say dangerous. She didn't say necessary. Just non-compliant. I waited until she finished. Then I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave papers. I simply placed a folder on the podium, flipped it open, and pointed. This is a photo taken 3 days before your contractors removed my barrier, I said. That's a sounder of Boars at the tree line. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I continued. This one I flipped again was the day after demolition. This boar was in the Pattersons' backyard, right where their toddler plays. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." I filed a formal report with Wildlife Services weeks ago, I said. Explained the risk, cited the trends, warned what would happen if the barrier came down. I paused, then looked directly at Janice. I also told you, twice. She blinked, hard. This isn't a question of non-compliance, I said to the room. It's a question of negligence. Dead silence. Then a voice from the back of the room, one of the older residents, broke the tension. "So what are you going to do about it, Mr. Brody?" I nodded once. "I'm going to make sure they can't do it to anyone else." The next morning, I brewed my coffee stronger than usual. Something about standing in front of a room full of people and drawing a line between truth and pretense has a way of sharpening the senses. My phone hadn't stopped vibrating since the meeting ended. Missed calls, texts from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. A few hostile, but most were grateful. Surprised maybe that someone had finally stood up to the HOA. One message stood out. It was from Carlos Ramirez, used to be a city attorney, now retired just up the hill from me. We'd only ever exchanged a few neighborly waves. But this message was different. "Elijah saw what happened last night. I've dealt with this kind of thing before. If you want to talk strategy, I'm around." Strategy. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about a barrier anymore. This was about setting precedent. If they could bulldoze a lawful, ecologically critical structure on my private land without due process, they could do it to anyone. And no amount of reason or reputation could stop them, unless I brought in something they feared more than exposure consequences. I called Carlos right after lunch. He answered on the first ring. "Elijah," he said, "I thought you might call." We met on his porch. Same forest wind, same scent of pine pitch and damp bark. Carlos had case files waiting. He'd seen it before, HOAs overstepping their bounds, hiding behind vaguely written bylaws, hoping nobody had the time or means to fight back. "This isn't just a civil nuisance," he said. "They authorized entry and destruction on titled property without a court order." He tapped a sheet with his pen. "Under California Penal Code, Chapter 602, that's trespassing. And depending on what you want to do next, we could be looking at tortious interference and property damage." I raised an eyebrow. "I want to stop them. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been steamrolled and silenced because they didn't know their rights." Carlos leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Well then," he said, "let's give them a civics lesson." We spent the next 3 days building a case. We compiled everything: photos, timestamps, emails, the original letters from the HOA. I recorded a sworn affidavit about the barrier's construction history, its ecological role, and my previous career with the Forest Service. Karen from Wildlife Services sent over 2 memos she'd signed, one outlining the current boar migration threat, the other confirming that the removal of the barrier had directly compromised the area's safety. We also dug into the HOA's own governance documents, and that's where we struck gold. Hidden in the fine print was a clause about jurisdiction. Any property not originally built within HOA planned development boundaries would require a vote by the majority of homeowners to expand the HOA's authority over it. Guess what? No vote had ever taken place regarding my land. Carlos whistled. "They assumed you'd never look, that you'd fold like everyone else." "Let's surprise them," I said. That same week, we filed a cease and desist letter demanding no further HOA enforcement actions on my property. It was direct, legal, and loud enough to force their hand. And then we filed the formal civil suit: unlawful destruction of property, trespassing, negligent endangerment, violation of state conservation protocols. I'll be honest, it felt strange standing in a courtroom again, this time not as an expert witness, but as a man with a grievance. But I knew what I was doing. Carlos insisted I speak for myself during the preliminary hearing, not because he couldn't do it, but because no one could describe what that barrier meant, what it had protected the way I could. So I stood there in front of a stone-faced judge and laid it out. 20 minutes of uninterrupted testimony. I spoke of Sarah, of our home, of the first boar attack, and the years of reinforcing the land with care. I detailed the topography, the wildlife patterns, the real purpose of that so-called unaesthetic barrier. Then I told him what happened, how they came without notice, without law, and how a single decision by an unelected board had turned my home and the neighborhood into a wildlife corridor. The judge didn't say much, but he nodded once, before ordering a full evidentiary review and temporarily barring the HOA from making any changes to properties without explicit legal consent. It was a win, not the end but a foothold. Back home, something unexpected started happening. Neighbors stopped avoiding me. Mrs. Lambert from 3 doors down, who once reported me for having too many tomato plants brought over a pie, said she was sorry for how things played out. Troy, a neighbor from the cul-de-sac, who I'd only ever nodded to in passing, knocked on my door one night and said I don't even like fences, but I like justice. They were waking up, seeing it. Some admitted they'd been fined for ridiculous things: flagpoles, porch chairs, even the color of mulch. Many had never pushed back. Some had tried and been shut down. But now with my lawsuit in motion, they were talking again. To each other. At potlucks. Over fences. On walks around the lake. Real community was beginning to form. Not enforced, but chosen. Of course, the HOA didn't stay quiet. Janice Mallory called a closed meeting of the board. They issued a newsletter accusing me of endangering the neighborhood by stirring unrest. They claimed I was seeking media attention and personal revenge. The irony nearly made me laugh. But Carlos advised me not to respond. Let them talk, he said. The more they scramble, the more they reveal. That's when a manila envelope showed up on my doorstep. No return address. Inside printed screenshots of emails between board members. One thread in particular stood out. Janice writing to another board member. He keeps quoting wildlife codes like he's the sheriff of the woods. If we don't do something fast, we'll lose the entire east boundary to him. And then the others will follow. Proof. They hadn't acted out of safety or community interest. They were trying to claim leverage. Control more land. Extend influence. That envelope was my powder keg. And the fuse had just been lit. It was just past 5 a.m. when I heard the diesel engines rumble up Pine Hollow Road again. I was standing at my kitchen sink coffee, half poured, when the sound hit me low and guttural like a threat whispered through the trees. I stepped out onto the porch, boots still untied, and saw the unmistakable shape of a flatbed hauling a yellow bulldozer crawling toward my property. Behind it, 2 pickup trucks, and then like vultures circling a fresh kill, a black SUV with Pine Hollow HOA magnets slapped on the doors. They came back, even after the cease and desist, even after the lawsuit was filed. The sheer audacity of it made my hands tremble, but not with fear. I reached for my phone and hit record before I'd even made it to the bottom step. The contractor stepped out first, young, bearded, and clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at the papers in his hand, then at me. "You Elijah Brody." "You know I am," I said. "Now who sent you?" He pointed toward the SUV, and out stepped Janice Mallory. Flawless white tennis outfit, clipboard clutched like a weapon. The faint smirk of someone who thought she'd already won. "Elijah," she called across the gravel, "we're not here to fight. You brought a bulldozer. It's a safety precaution," she replied smoothly. "The board has determined that the terrain along your eastern edge presents a wildfire risk due to overgrowth. We're simply implementing vegetation control, without permission, on private land, under legal review." She gave a little shrug. "We have community interest to protect." I took a step closer. "Janice, you're violating an active judicial order. You want to test how fast a judge can sign a contempt citation." She flinched, barely. Then she motioned to the contractor. "Let's get started." To his credit, the young man hesitated. He looked at me, then at the SUV again. "I'm gonna need to see an actual permit," he said. Janice snapped. "You have the work order. Proceed." "No," I said, voice steady. "You won't. Because this," I pulled a folded document from my back pocket, "is a copy of the judge's injunction. You so much as scrape my dirt with that blade, and you're complicit in unlawful trespass." The contractor backed away. Janice turned red. Literally red, her face blotched with frustration. "Elijah, don't be dramatic." That was her mistake. Because at that exact moment, another truck pulled up, this one unmarked but familiar. Out stepped Deputy Nolan Burke from the county sheriff's office. Broad-shouldered, no nonsense, and someone I'd once helped rescue a trapped mountain lion from a ravine. He surveyed the scene with quiet disgust. "Ms. Mallory," he said, "approaching the bulldozer, you and your equipment need to leave this property. Now," she blustered. "But we're acting in the best interest of the neighborhood." Nolan didn't blink. "Then act from the sidewalk. You've been formally notified to stay off Mr. Brody's land. And if I see you here again before this court case is settled, I'll be arresting you for contempt, not just trespass." Janice's mouth opened and closed twice like a fish out of water. Finally, she turned, barked something into her phone, and stormed back to her SUV. The convoy reversed out, slow, ashamed, and defeated. I looked over at Nolan. "Thanks." He just nodded. "Saw the court docket come through last night. Figured they'd try something." Before he left, he added, "You're not the only one fed up, Elijah. People are talking." And they were. By afternoon, the video I posted of the confrontation had gone viral in our neighborhood forum. Comments flooded in. She tried to demolish it again. He had a court order. What was she thinking? We should call an emergency meeting. This has gone too far. The next day, flyers began appearing in mailboxes. Not from the HOA, from the residents. Simple black and white sheets with bold lettering. "Enough is enough. Community forum tonight. No HOA approval needed." It was held in the park by the lake. Over 70 households showed up. Parents with kids, seniors with lawn chairs, even a few teenagers who came just to see what the fuss was about. I stood back at first, content to watch, but soon people started asking me to speak. So I did. I stepped up onto a picnic bench and let my voice carry across the dusk-lit grass. I didn't start this for power, I began. I started it because they tore down something that kept us safe. And then they blamed me when the consequences hit. Heads nodded, people murmured in agreement. But this is bigger than a barrier now. It's about whether we let people who don't listen make decisions for all of us. It's about dignity, about law, about not being bullied by a handful of people who think a clipboard gives them authority. Someone shouted, "What can we do about it?" And that's when Troy stood up and raised the clipboard. "We call a recall vote." Gasps, then whispers, then growing confidence. "Can we do that?" "Yes," Troy said, pulling out his own copy of the HOA bylaws. "If we gather 25% of households to sign a petition, we can demand a vote to remove the board entirely." People started crowding around him. Pens came out. Clipboards passed from hand to hand. Within 2 hours, we had 94 signatures. More than enough. The HOA had fired the first shot when they bulldozed that barrier. But now they had woken up a neighborhood. And I wasn't alone anymore. That night, as I walked home beneath the thick silhouettes of pine trees, I thought about Sarah. I could almost feel her beside me again, her warm hand in mine. Her laughter echoing as if the wild boars had sparked not just chaos, but a quiet revolt. I touched the smooth cedar plank she once carved our initials into, and I made myself a promise. This wouldn't end with just a vote. This would end with something better. 2 nights after the meeting at the lake, just before midnight, my phone lit up with a call from the sheriff's office. It wasn't Nolan. It was dispatch. The woman on the other end sounded winded, like she'd just sprinted across the building. "Mr. Brody, we've got multiple calls coming from Pine Hollow Circle. Reports of wild animals, possible hogs, damaging vehicles and yards." My stomach dropped. How many calls? 6 separate households in the last 30 minutes. I threw on jeans, grabbed my boots, my flashlight, and my radio scanner, and was out the door before she even hung up. The air outside was still and electric. You know that kind of stillness before a storm, when every tree holds its breath. That's what it felt like as I rolled down the gravel and turned toward the heart of the neighborhood. As I pulled up, blue lights flashed across cracked pavement and torn lawns. Deputy Nolan was already on the scene, speaking to 2 panicked residents in bathrobes. I parked, stepped out, and my boots crunched on something sharp. Broken plastic, a shattered garden light. A woman saw me and rushed forward. "They were huge," she cried. "They came through the fence like it wasn't even there." Snorting, digging, slamming into things. Her hands shook. She had scratches on her arms, not deep but fresh. A boar had charged her flower bed. Another man limped up behind her, holding a broken rake. "I tried to scare them off," he muttered. They didn't care. By the time the animal control truck arrived, it was chaos. Multiple yards destroyed. 3 cars damaged. 2 people mildly injured, 1 sprained ankle, 1 bruised hip. But it could have been worse, and it wasn't over. I tracked the prints with a flashlight down toward a low point in the neighborhood where runoff from the forest gathered in a shallow basin during rainy season. That's where I found the trail-deep grooves in the mud, hooves layered on hooves like a mass migration had cut through the community. Nolan stepped beside me. "You were right," he said, quiet. I just nodded. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like a warning answered too late. By morning, photos had already hit the local news. Wild hogs invade Pine Hollow neighborhood. Multiple homes damaged. It wasn't sensationalized. The pictures spoke for themselves. Overturned trash bins, gashes in wooden decks, 1 backyard trampoline, shredded like tissue. Karen from Wildlife Services showed up around noon with 2 of her field techs. They set up trail cameras, bait traps, and issued an official wildlife advisory for the entire Pine Hollow area. Her press statement was brief but brutal. "The removal of natural and artificial barriers along this corridor has disrupted the migratory behavior of invasive species. We strongly advise residents to avoid unnecessary outdoor activity after dark and report any sightings immediately." She didn't mention the HOA by name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. At that afternoon's impromptu town hall held in the high school gym, due to the number of attendees, Janice tried to regain control. She brought chart statements, a poor intern who read off mitigation strategies. But the crowd wasn't interested in mitigation. They wanted accountability. A young mother stood up first. "My 5-year-old found blood on his swing set this morning," she said, voice trembling. "You told us it was just about keeping the neighborhood beautiful." Then came Mr. Ellis, retired firefighter. "I warned you 3 months ago. I told you that barrier was the only thing holding them back. And you laughed. More voices rose. The room boiled. Finally, someone shouted, "When's the recall vote?" Janice blanched. And that's when Troy stood up and raised the clipboard. Saturday, 4 p.m., Community Clubhouse, ballot style, monitored, transparent. We have the legal right under the bylaws. Janice tried to interrupt, but he shut her down with a single sentence. This isn't about your bylaws anymore. It's about survival. After that, she sat down, silent. For once, that evening, I walked the perimeter of my property with a thermos of coffee and my .45 holster just in case. I looked out across the place where my barrier used to be. Open now. Vulnerable. But strangely, it didn't feel hopeless, because something had shifted in Pine Hollow. People weren't hiding behind HOA rules anymore. They were standing together. At dusk, a group of kids from 3 blocks over came up the slope dragging lumber and post-hole diggers. Mr. Brody. One of them said, maybe 14, all braces and freckles. Can we help put the barrier back? I didn't know what to say, so I just handed them gloves, and we started digging. No orders, no fines, no board approval. Just people neighbors rebuilding what should never have been torn down. The forest had broken loose, but so had the truth. And truth, once exposed, is harder to fence back in than any wild animal you'll ever meet. 2 days after the boar incident, while I was replacing barrier posts with the help of the local teens and a few determined retirees, Janice Mallory went live on a local news segment. I didn't watch it when it aired. I was too busy mixing concrete and brushing off splinters, but my phone lit up like a Christmas tree 10 minutes after the broadcast. Neighbors sent texts, friends sent clips. Even Karen from Wildlife Services left me a voicemail that started with, "You're going to love this, except you'll probably want to punch something first." So I sat down, wiped the dirt from my hands, and watched. The segment was barely 4 minutes long. Janice stood in front of the HOA clubhouse, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Her blouse was perfect. Her hair was immaculate. Her words were poison dipped in honey. "We're doing everything we can to protect this community," she said into the mic, her eyes glistening with carefully manufactured concern. But unfortunately, not everyone has acted with the same responsibility. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. She gestured vaguely toward the tree line. There have been unregulated barriers, non-standard landscaping choices, and a refusal to coordinate with the HOA on community safety matters. Then came the kicker. And while we understand the frustration, we must remind residents that private choices can have public consequences. Private choices. Public consequences. They were hanging the wild boar attack on me, on the guy who'd built the damn barrier. The guy who warned them, documented the threats, filed reports, pleaded for sanity. And now I was the villain. It felt surreal, but also predictable. Bullies always rewrite history when the crowd gets too loud. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with an old field notebook Sarah gave me, flipping through sketches and wildlife logs from years gone by. I tried to quiet my mind, tried to keep the anger from curdling into something worse. But around 2 a.m., I made a decision. If they wanted a war of words, I'd give them something stronger. Truth. On paper. Signed. Sworn. With exhibits. By morning, I'd written a full public statement structured like a court filing. It included photos of the original barrier time-stamped, records of my multiple warnings to the HOA, my initial cease and desist letter and their response or lack thereof, and testimony from Karen Owens and the Wildlife Services team. A signed statement from Deputy Nolan about the attempted second bulldozing and the court injunction. Even aerial drone shots taken by Troy's nephew showing how the gap in the barrier lined up directly with the path the boars took into Pine Hollow Circle. I printed 50 copies, taped one to the HOA bulletin board, slid the rest into mailboxes, uploaded the PDF online with a public share link. Within 2 hours, it had 300 downloads. By noon, it had been reshared to every local group on social media. And that's when things really turned. People were angry, not just mildly irritated like before, not just discontented, but furious. Mothers who had been told they overreacted, seniors who'd paid arbitrary fines for solar lights, veterans who'd been told to remove their flags because they didn't match the community palette. They saw this for what it was, a cover-up, a scapegoating, and more than that, a betrayal. The same HOA that had plastered safety-first posters all over the neighborhood pool was now smearing the one person who had actually protected them. That night, someone taped a handwritten sign to the HOA office door. "We see through you now." Another was planted in the lawn across from Janice's house. "You tore down a barrier and unleashed us instead." It was happening. The neighborhood wasn't just stirred up anymore. It was awake. They started organizing. Sandra Lee, an accountant and mother of three, set up a public town hall scheduled 3 days before the recall vote. She invited both sides to speak. The HOA declined, so the stage was left to those of us with truth on our side. Troy presented copies of the bylaws, showing the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. Karen explained in plain English how the Boars had been redirected by the missing barrier. I read part of my original cease and desist letter out loud. Even the sheriff's department sent a statement confirming that my property had been violated and that the situation had escalated due to improper HOA enforcement. By the end of the night, residents were lining up to speak. A teenager who helped me dig post holes said I've lived here my whole life, but I never saw adults stand up like this. A woman whose husband had a heart condition said, "When those hogs came through, I thought I was going to lose him. And they still tried to blame someone else." People cried. People clapped. And for the first time in years, Pine Hollow felt human again. Not manufactured, not manicured, but real. Flawed, maybe, but breathing united and just angry enough to change everything. Saturday came heavy with tension. The morning air sat thick over Pine Hollow like a held breath. Every mailbox wore a flyer, now each one printed with the recall details. The time, the location, the purpose. It was all legal, all properly executed under Section 4D of the HOA bylaws, and yet somehow it still felt like we were planning a revolution. In a way, we were. The community clubhouse hadn't seen this much foot traffic since the 4th of July pancake breakfast 4 years ago. But this time, there were no balloons or music. Just folding tables, volunteers, voter rosters, and a growing crowd that spilled out the front doors and down the sidewalk. I arrived early before the doors opened. Sandra Lee, clipboard in hand and jaw set, like a soldier in formation, greeted me with a half smile. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded, as I'll ever be. Inside, the volunteers moved efficiently. One by one, they verified homeowners, distributed ballots, and collected sealed envelopes in transparent boxes guarded by 3 rotating residents and a sheriff's deputy on site for security. They weren't taking any chances. Neither were we. Troy had spent the last 2 days organizing an audit process and even recruited a retired judge to serve as a neutral overseer. Carlos, my legal counsel, stood at the back of the room in a plain blue polo, sipping coffee and watching it all unfold like a chess match he already knew how to win. The board members showed up 30 minutes late. Janice arrived wearing sunglasses, as if they could shield her from what was coming. She walked straight to the front and stood like she still held power, but the room had already shifted. No one rose. No one offered her a chair. She stood alone. When the voting ended at 4:00 p.m., we closed the doors and began the count. No dramatics, no shouting, just a methodical sorting, number after number. People stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their breath as if they were waiting to hear a diagnosis. When the tally was complete, Sandra stood on the small platform with the microphone in her hand. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but it firmed with every syllable. We had 168 eligible households participate in today's vote. The bylaws require a 60% majority to recall the current HOA board. She took a breath. The final vote, 47 in favor of recall, 31 opposed. For a split-second silence. Then the room erupted. Not in chaos, but in cathartic, roaring, soul-ringing relief. Claps, cheering, tears. I felt hands slap my back, arms reach for handshakes, neighbors pulling me into tight emotional embraces. I couldn't stop smiling. Not because I'd won, but because we had. Together. Carlos leaned in and whispered, "It's done. You just made history in this zip code." I looked across the room at Janice. She hadn't moved. Her mouth was tight. Her sunglasses still perched like armor, but her hands had started to tremble. She knew. This wasn't just a vote. It was a verdict. Sandra continued reading from the charter. The current HOA board is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. Interim board members will be selected from volunteer residents until a new election can be formally held in 30 days. The room broke into applause again. Troy raised his arm and shouted, "For the barrier." Laughter followed. The tension cracked and fell away like brittle bark from an old tree. We didn't stay in that room long. People flooded into the cul-de-sac like it was a block party, bringing out coolers, folding chairs, music from car stereos. Even Nolan the deputy dropped by off-duty just to watch. Karen showed up too with a small bottle of cider and a grin wider than I'd ever seen on her. "Guess you got your line redrawn," she said, lifting the bottle toward me. "Guess I did," I replied. That night, I sat on my porch while the wind hummed low through the trees. The new barrier line gleamed under the setting sun, solid, clean, reinforced. Safe again. But it wasn't the cedar posts or barbed wire that brought the calm. It was the unity, the refusal to be silenced, the knowledge that when one neighbor speaks up, others might follow, not immediately, not loudly, but with hearts that recognize justice when they see it. I pulled out my old field notebook, again flipped past Sarah's sketches, and jotted down a new note. July 22nd. Barrier rebuilt. Forest still intact. Neighborhood transformed. A soft knock interrupted the silence. I opened the door to find Emma, a shy girl from 3 houses down, whose mother often waved to me from her garden, clutching a small, potted plant. "My mom said this is for you," she said shyly. "For protecting us." I crouched down and smiled. "You tell your mom I was just doing what anyone should." She tilted her head. "Will the Boars come back?" "Maybe," I said gently. "But we'll be ready next time." I took the plant, set it beside Sarah's wind chime, and watched it sway in the golden breeze. We'd built barriers to keep danger out, but somewhere along the way, we'd also built bridges between people who had once been strangers behind manicured lawns, and that, more than anything, was what saved us. The Monday after the recall vote, I drove into town with a folder full of evidence and a determination I hadn't felt since my Forest Service days. I wasn't just closing this chapter. I was setting fire to the pages the HOA had written behind closed doors. At the county courthouse, Carlos and I filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, not just civil, but criminal. Trespassing, destruction of private property, falsifying jurisdiction. Our case wasn't just solid. It was a fortress. Karen had submitted supplemental reports to back us up, and Nolan, God bless him, had already handed over his incident reports from both bulldozer encounters, including body cam footage from the second one. It showed everything. Janice's refusal to back down. My warning. The work order without a single legal signature. And most importantly, her reaction when she realized law enforcement wasn't on her side. 2 days later, the Pine County Register ran a front-page story. HOA board ousted after wildlife disaster deal investigates potential charges. I didn't expect the mayor to reach out, but he did. Called me personally. "Elijah, I've been following this situation closely," he said, his voice careful, political. "I'm not here to defend the HOA, but I think there's an opportunity to turn this mess into something meaningful." "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "A task force, community-led wildland boundary planning. You chair it." I blinked. "Me? You're the only person in this district with first-hand experience in both forest management and HOA disaster fallout," he said. "We've had complaints for years, but your case is the one that finally pierced the noise." That night, I sat on the porch and thought it through. Did I really want to lead another committee? After all the damage, the noise, the exhausting push to be heard. But then I thought of Emma's question. Will the Boars come back? The truth was they would. Nature didn't operate on recall votes. And if I could do something to make sure what happened to us didn't happen to the next community along the forest line, maybe it was worth it. So I accepted. The first task force meeting was held at City Hall, not the clubhouse. A dozen voices around the table, fire mitigation experts, wildlife biologists, landowners, and yes, even a few reformed HOA members who'd voted for the recall and wanted to make things right. We drafted guidelines for neighborhood developments near forest borders, required wildlife impact assessments, emergency preparedness audits, limitations on aesthetic codes, when safety structures like my barrier were involved. It was bureaucratic work, sure, but it was also necessary, and it gave the chaos meaning. Meanwhile, the investigation into the former board gained traction. 2 of the board members lawyered up fast. Janice, she went silent. No press appearances, no statements. Rumor had it she tried to move out of state, but was stopped by a subpoena tied to a second case, this one involving financial misconduct. Turns out the HOA's books were dirtier than the fence posts they tore out of my land. Unauthorized landscaping contracts, inflated maintenance charges, even a quarterly payment to a shell company called Civic Harmony Solutions, which shockingly was registered under her husband's name. Carlos and I watched it all unfold like spectators at a slow-motion avalanche. Not because we were gloating, but because we both knew when people cling too tightly to power, they usually slip and fall with it. 3 weeks later, I stood once again at the edge of my property. The new barrier line curved beautifully along the ridgeline, reinforced with stone footings and steel crossbars. We'd planted rosemary and lavender along the base, natural deterrents that smelled a whole lot better than chemical spray. And this time, it wasn't just my work. It was community built. Families who showed up on weekends, Teenagers who'd never held a post-hole digger before. Even Mr. Ellis, the retired firefighter with arthritis, hammered nails with the stubbornness of a man 20 years younger. It was no longer just my barrier. It was ours. And the forest, now respectfully walled and welcomed, seemed quieter somehow. Less tense. One morning, I caught sight of a sounder of boars passing beyond the tree line. They didn't approach. They didn't test the barrier. They just moved on. I watched them disappear into the trees, then turned to see Emma, drawing chalk on the new path beside the barrier. When she saw me, she waved. "Hi, Mr. Brody, my mom says we're safe now." I smiled. Not because the threat was gone, but because we finally had people who could recognize one. That afternoon, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside a folded note and a single broken piece of cedar post. The note read, "I was wrong. I see it now. The barrier wasn't the problem we were. May your next boundary never be crossed." There was no name, but I knew who had sent it, and I didn't need her apology to feel vindicated, because what we'd reclaimed was never just land. It was our voice, our place, our peace, and we'd won it not through shouting, but through truth spoken firmly, plainly, and without apology. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. Held in the county courthouse's old oak-paneled Room 3B, a place where time felt like it moved slower, where the air always smelled faintly of paper polish and tension. It wasn't a criminal trial, not yet, but it was the kind of public accountability that few in our town had ever seen. On the docket, Brody vs. Pine Hollow, HOA former board members. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and press, but with the very people who'd felt the sting of the board's decisions over the past 5 years. Folks who'd been fined for bird feeders for hanging a wind chime for planting vegetables in their own yards. People who never thought they'd set foot in a courtroom. But today, they came to witness something that resembled justice. Carlos sat beside me at the long wooden table tie, straight eyes forward. He had that calm energy about him that made you believe the sky could be falling, and he'd still find a legal precedent for staying calm under it. "Remember," he said quietly, "truth is our loudest weapon today." The judge, an older woman named Peterson, with silver hair and no time for theatrics, called us to order. The HOA's side was thinner than expected. Only Janice and one remaining former board member showed up. The others had quietly settled their civil liabilities out of court once the audit revealed misused funds. Janice, however, refused to fold. She wore a gray suit with sharp lines, her hair drawn back like she meant to win a debate, not answer for a disaster. But this wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Carlos presented first. He started with the timeline, the installation of the barrier, my legal ownership of the land, the clear historical precedent of the barrier's purpose. He played the body cam footage of Janice standing on my land, dismissing the cease and desist order like it was a grocery list. Gasps moved through the gallery like a wave. Then came the photographs, side-by-side comparisons of the property before and after the barrier's removal. Then the boar damage. Then the statements from Wildlife Services. By the time he was done, Judge Peterson looked like she'd read a horror novel without a break. Janice's attorney rose to respond, and I braced for the usual deflections. But instead, the lawyer merely tried to minimize. "To be clear, Your Honor, the board's intent was never malicious, merely misguided in the execution of what they believed were their duties." Judge Peterson raised a single eyebrow. "So they believed their duties included bulldozing private property without a court order." "No, Your Honor, but..." "Let me rephrase," the judge interrupted. "Do you deny that your client authorized equipment onto Mr. Brody's land in violation of a filed injunction?" There was a long pause. "No, Your Honor." "And do you deny that her decisions as board president directly preceded an invasive animal event that caused property damage, community panic, and injury?" "No, Your Honor." Judge Peterson closed the file in front of her with a definitive clap. "Well then," she turned to Janice. "Ms. Mallory, do you have anything to say?" Janice stood. For a moment, her mouth opened, but no words came. Then she cleared her throat and said, "I believed I was doing the right thing for the neighborhood. I didn't realize the ecological implications." The judge tilted her head. "You were provided multiple reports, emails, and a cease and desist letter. You were informed, and you ignored those warnings. This wasn't ignorance, Ms. Mallory, it was arrogance." She turned back toward us. "In light of the evidence, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Elijah Brody." There was no applause, only the sound of a collective exhale. The judge continued, "I am ordering full restitution for the cost of barrier reconstruction, ecological remediation, and legal fees. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges relating to trespass, willful property destruction, and fraudulent use of HOA authority. That last part, that was unexpected. Carlos leaned toward me. She's not playing softball. Janice sat back down slowly, as though the weight of her own decisions had finally settled on her shoulders. Her face was pale, her hands no longer steady. After court adjourned, I walked outside into the sunlight. People followed, some clapping me on the back, others just nodding as they passed, as if to say, "You did what we couldn't. You stood up when we sat down." I didn't need their praise, but I accepted their respect, because that meant more. Sandra met me at the courthouse steps. "We're holding a community dinner this weekend," she said, "at the park. Everyone wants you there." I smiled. "Is there pie?" "3 kinds," she grinned. Carlos emerged next, already packing up his notes. "You did well," he said. "You didn't just win a case, you changed how this town sees itself." I looked back toward the courthouse doors, which had closed behind Janice and her attorney like a gavel sealing the past shut. "I didn't want to change it," I said. "I just wanted to protect what was already worth keeping." That evening, I stood at the edge of the rebuilt barrier. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting the treetops in gold. I reached out and touched the fresh cedar warm from the day's heat. Behind me, laughter echoed from the neighborhood children playing, dogs barking, someone barbecuing. The wild had come close, but it hadn't won. Neither had the ones who tried to strip us of our voice. This wasn't just about barriers anymore. It was about boundaries, and about learning to defend them, not just from animals, but from the people who forget that power has limits. That truth once spoken has a way of echoing louder than any rule book ever could. 3 months after the hearing, Pine Hollow didn't look the same. The barriers still stood. The trees still whispered in the wind. But the people, we, had changed. There was a different kind of energy now. Not the stiff-clipped tension of compliance and fines, but movement. Voices. Barbecues where there used to be silence. Neighbors talking across lawns that had once been battlegrounds over mulch color and flower height. And me, I was still here. Still rising at dawn. Still drinking black coffee from the same chipped mug Sarah bought me on our 5th anniversary. Still walking the edge of my land every morning, boots steady on pine needles and stone. But now I wasn't walking alone. At least once a week, someone would join me, Troy with his dog, or Emma with her chalk, or Nolan on his day off. Sometimes we said nothing, just listened to the forest breathe. And in that quiet, there was healing. The old HOA clubhouse had been repurposed. No longer the seat of petty power, it was now the Pine Hollow Community Resource Center. Volunteers staffed it on rotation. Sandra managed the calendar-free classes on fire safety, wildlife awareness, even vegetable gardening. We even held a fence rebuild day for 3 families who lived near the forest line but couldn't afford the materials. The wood was donated by a local lumberyard that heard about our story on the radio. People from 3 counties showed up to help. The barrier wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a symbol. And in late October, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A letter. No return address. Inside was a check, $3.200, and a note handwritten in narrow slanted script. While I voted against the recall. I believed what they told me. I was wrong. Please use this to help someone else finish rebuilding. I stared at it for a long time, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. That even the loudest voices of opposition could soften, could return, could change. I took the check straight to Sandra. She used it to build a memorial bench in the park with a carved inscription onto the barrier that stood between us and the storm. It wasn't just for me. It was for all of us. The night of the community potluck, I stood at the grill flipping burgers next to Mr. Ellis, who now insisted on being called the mayor of Brisket. Kids ran past with glow sticks. Emma held court over a blanket full of crayons, showing other children how to draw wild boars that don't get inside barriers. Carlos showed up late, as always, and handed me a folded newspaper from the next county over. The headline read, "Small Town Overthrows HOA. Rebuilds Stronger." There was a photo of me standing in front of the barrier, hands on my hips. I laughed. It looked like I was posing. Truth was, I'd just finished hammering in a new gate and didn't know the reporter was taking pictures. Famous now, Carlos teased. Infamous, maybe. We sat under the string lights as music played from someone's porch speaker. Carlos grew quiet after a while, sipping a beer and watching the fireflies dance above the lawn. Then he said, "You know what made the difference, Elijah?" "What?" "You didn't fight them to win. You fought them to protect. and people saw the difference. I didn't know how to answer that, so I nodded. The fire crackled. Someone played an old country song I hadn't heard since before Sarah passed, and for a moment time folded. I could almost feel Sarah beside me again, her warm hand in mine. Her laughter echoing as if the wild boars had sparked not just chaos, but a quiet revolt. It would have made her proud. The next morning, I did what I always did. Woke up early, pulled on my boots, walked the line of the barrier. At the eastern edge, the new gate stood tall reinforced steel with a latch. Even a bear couldn't pry open. On the inside, I'd carved a simple message into the wood with my old forestry knife. But we keep what we respect. Behind me, the house stood quiet. The forest ahead even quieter. But inside me, there was peace. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that comes after the fire when what's left is stronger than what stood before. When neighbors become family. When boundaries are rebuilt not with fear but with purpose. When voices that once trembled rise together. And when a man who just wanted to protect his wife's garden ends up showing an entire community how to protect their future. Pine Hollow would never forget what happened. But we weren't defined by the chaos. We were defined by the response. By the hands that rebuilt. By the words that exposed. By the strength of a barrier and the spirit of those who dared to stand beside it. As I turned to walk back toward the porch, I paused and looked once more at the edge of the woods, and whispered not to the trees or the barrier or even to Sarah, but to myself. We're safe now.